Now, we have 25 minutes for this, which is 5 minutes maximum each. And we're going to go in order this way, which means I really do need you to keep to your 5 minutes, because one of two things will happen if you don't. Either we're going to be even later for drinks, or poor Regina here at the end won't get to say anything, and she'll get very grumpy. So, Agi, do you want to kick off with what was happening in the climate session? Thank you.
So on climate action, I tried to be really brief and not repeat everything that was said there, but I would say what was very encouraging to me is that we still had some of the standard discussions, you know, the same order about advocacy and so forth, but I must say more than half of the discussion was on non-standard, and I think that's what we're looking for. We want to hear forward-looking thinking and what we can do differently. So a few things that came out of it that I think we can build on tomorrow very well. One is really going back a lot to information, data, and sharing of that. So I think it's one of the kind of standard but non-standard framing and recommendation is to have a different kind of climate information platform. And I'm saying different because what we were saying is that actionable information will bring action. So the information needs to be in a way, in a layman's terms, that is easy to act upon, easy to understand, and it's engaging not for the sake of advocacy, but for the sake of action. The second thing is to look at the policy and regulatory frameworks, especially on standards. Standards for various things. Standards, for example, on reporting. How are we going to measure our impact on the SDGs, on the sustainability elements? How could we use a standard framework for that that's internationally recognized and everybody signs up for it? And secondly, standards on technology. So for one of the concrete suggestions is to introduce standards to switch from AC to DC, which will in itself save 20% of electricity. And lastly, a lot of emphasis on the partnership side. How and why some of these solutions worked and some of these solutions can be more scalable is because of the involvement of neutral entities, credible partners, citizens' involvement in the design, and essentially something that could lead to a regional compact that could be a basis for further action. So I think I'll stop there.
Brilliant. Thanks, Agi. That's how we like it. Short, sharp, but interesting. You had what you would call non-standard conversations, which is really good to hear because that's what we want. We don't want to hear the same old thing, new things. Excellent. Lauren, what was going on with you in the urbanization?
So in the urbanization sessions, we had some really excellent presentations on framing from very diverse cities, Islamabad, Jakarta, and Bangkok. And they presented problems from water shortages to traffic and congestion. So not problems that would surprise you. Then they were complemented by several initiatives that provide data. And so that was the first point that we really rested on, that there are a number of platforms, whether it was PwC's platform that allows business to go in and look at how they can contribute to development goals, or to those that are providing ways for cities to articulate what their goals are. So from the ASEAN Smart Cities Network, which we also heard from this morning, the 100 Resilient Cities platform, and the importance of tracking what it is and setting those goals. So there were a number of platforms that were shared from EBAT also on sustainability and ecological diversity that gave people a window into what's possible. Interestingly enough, the representative from Cisco reminded us that your perspective and the quality of your data is actually going to really drive what's going on. So we had a discussion that I think we will come back to on how to ensure that you are tracking the right kind of data, not just integrating any data. And he really left us with an interesting quote that I will share with you, which is that sensors don't live in cities, people live in cities, so that everything has some perspective to it. We were, I think, very inspired by the possibilities of both district cooling solutions for cities and also ecosystem services. And one other really standout quote that folks were hanging on to was that ecosystems don't like zero. So they can absorb a lot if you restore them in meaningful ways, but this is generational work. And we looked at the example of Tianjin that Keppel presented to us. This is a fantastic example of an eco-city, but one that didn't happen overnight. So I think we're gonna come back to those issues of getting to your vision, being able to measure it with existing tools, and also having the patience to do the work. I think finally we ended in a place where we had challenged folks to come up with the best solutions, but the participants in the session kind of got onto us and realized that was an impossible task and came back with the answer that because cities are very complex, it really requires context to get to the right solution. And so most of our tables refuse to pick a winner, and that sets us up very, very well for tomorrow when we'll be working with specific cities on specific solutions. So I'm really looking forward to re-engaging with the whole urbanization track tomorrow when we dig deeper into specific problems with 4 cities.
Excellent, thank you. But back to the data being a key driver of what needs to happen.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Simon, what was going on with circular economy?
So just to acknowledge the impossible task of summarising 3 hours of conversation in 3 minutes, I feel like it's an accelerated version of Chinese whispers. We started off by really talking about challenges and engaging the entire supply chain and recognising that behaviour change needs to occur at the level of the consumer to the producer, right through the circular economy. And how do we find ways of introducing economic incentives? One of the conversations that came up was that procurement departments are often trained to focus on saving money, but sometimes we need to find ways of having procurement departments buy something slightly more expensive that's able to add value more broadly through the life cycle of the product. We spoke about potential ways of looking at fines for punishment, for producing waste or not disposing of waste correctly. And really quite a large conversation on how do we price in value to supply chains that is different to just economic value. There was a great anecdote from Hendrik from UNDP talking about this idea of creating symbiotic industrial parks, and how we're not just talking about necessarily circularity at the level of the individual business, but creating systems that are able to facilitate symbiosis and circularity. We got into solutions, and there was a solution presented by Coca-Cola in partnership with UNDP that focused on a large platform play involving 91 different stakeholders in India that looked at empowering waste pickers to be able to collect plastic waste and create and add value to that plastic waste by adding it back into the Coca-Cola supply chain. That was informed by commitments from Coca-Cola to increase the percentage of recycled stock that goes into their products, with a commitment in 2030 to 100% recycled stock and 100% recyclable products. Many of the conversations were talking about engaging the informal sector, and we also talked about the need to not only innovate around the supply of innovations in the waste and recycling space, but to create a demand for the innovations that these products were actually, these innovations were supplying. So how do you encourage companies to want to buy recycled materials as well? Just to finish, I think it's an important acknowledgement that there was quite a strong pushback from some of them, from the audience, that the solutions overly focused on waste and recycling, and a recognition that a circular economy includes designing, redesigning, reusing, new business models, and a range of different interventions. And perhaps that's something that we can work on as a group to really expand our thinking beyond what we ended up focusing on, which was really around plastics and waste and recycling.
Okay, thank you. So that's something to take into tomorrow. Jeremy, you were looking at human rights.
Yes, and it was a really interesting discussion stream, and I think it's actually set up as a good cliffhanger for tomorrow. Because on this stage, what we heard from the very beginning is, number one, there's clear-cut responsibility and framework for business and human rights. We do know, protect, respect, and remedy. And the challenge was put down about how do we get to scale, how do we avoid the challenge of a special program for just the few, how do we invite dialogue and inclusion? And that was what was here. Now, the second discussion that happened was really interesting, and it got much deeper into some of those ideas. And again, those 3 key focuses are important. We talked about how do we frame the issue, and the topics that were on the table were, of course, child labor, equality and gender and women's empowerment, migration and dignified work, modern slavery, forced labor, bonded labor. And these were talked about within the challenges of this region and also globally. And that's one, those are some of the issues. The second thing that was really interesting was, okay, but what's important is how does business operationalize solutions here? And operationalization around understanding and about supply chains, engaging consumers, and paying and transparency were also really important. And the third one, thinking remedy, we heard a very strong voice around how can human rights defenders be protected? And this is the question on who stands up for whose rights? How does business operate in that environment? How does that relate to government and corruption and transparency and enforcement? Those are some of the key issues in session 2. And then the third one is we started diving in even deeper. And we heard about 6 different short presentations from a variety of organizations, mostly business, about what they are doing. And whether it's about responsible recruitment, which HP talked about this morning, whether it's around CAFE standards from Mars, but also the right to an identity and the ability to provide birth certificates, the idea about timekeeping and overtime recording and turning that into an industry standard, how do you engage your supply chain and build internally, and then how do we support human rights defenders, and what is the role of business? We talked very briefly about scale and stakeholder inclusion, because those are the 2 pieces that we need to weave into all of these solutions if we get beyond the challenge of that one small pilot that helps a few people. It's a great story, but where does it end up to? In scale, there are some key things. We need to engage corporates throughout the organization, from senior management through middle management to the ground. We need to think outside of your normal industry. Money matters, that was my bit. And government engagement, how do we get to that? And as we think about multi-stakeholder engagement, being clear about divisions of labor, investing in a shared viewpoint, having a clear focus on what you're trying to achieve, and also important, how do we get the voice of those impacted, the voice of the worker in the supply chain, helping to think, work on, and engage on these issues? That's what makes us powerful. And so both my anticipation and my sympathies for tomorrow as you take these ideas, put them together, and turn them into, okay, what comes next? So it was a fascinating and interesting conversation.
And you set the stage for some really hard work tomorrow. Excellent, you hear that? And brilliant, thank you very much, Jeremy. Regina, you have your time. What was going on in your session on food and nutrition?
Yeah, thank you very much. So we started off and discussing, we were setting the stage, and we were discussing about 4 main issues that actually are very common to the food and nutrition sector. It's about affordability, it's about accessibility, availability, and then nutrition safety, food safety, which we would say viability. And we had discussions about this. We also had the point about what is the economic impact if you don't achieve one of those 4 big points. We also made the point that technology should be embraced and not actually shy away, even though food and nutrition is a very emotional subject. So often we are actually shying away to embrace new technology. We had, in our panel discussions, we had the plea, the ask for agriculture to be used for nutrition and not just agriculture for producing, which meant that we actually, when we look at urban areas, we really have to look at, can we use agricultural, urban farming to really meet the nutrition needs that we have? And under this also, it was mentioned that we need to have key partnerships, very tackling the issues we need and not just having and talking about partnerships. The same went for another subject, which went through some of your points as well, is about the food waste. We talked about how actually food waste, the issue of food waste, can also benefit the low-income consumers. What do we do into this? We had a country program example, a country real example, which actually walked us through. It's a practical example which walked us through from working across the different sectors in a country, which in our earlier discussions, we said that food and nutrition is cross-sectorial, so the representative of the country really made it very clear that yes, in reality, it is a very multi-sector issue. In terms of the solutions, some of the panelists brought forward solutions about how we can increase micronutrient intake by giving a very specific country example. Again, partnerships were brought up. We also had examples on how we can tackle new communications to very target groups, like we have the 1,000 days birth until 2nd year of a child, which is a very critical period for development, and pregnant women, so new communication style was presented. We also got an example from how can we actually make sure that we can guarantee uptake of a product. So this was more about how can we make access to nutritious food available. And then we had finding ways to activate and empowering communities to empower each other and also to inform each other. So examples were brought forward when it comes to looking for how can we actually have efficient communications to really reach the community at the community level and also at the household level. And I think for tomorrow morning, we will go and discuss a bit further on what the solutions were brought forward and dig in terms of what are the real commitments we would need from the different sectors.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. That's really well done, panel. We've done it well inside time, but you've got all your messages across short and sharp to this group, which is great. The two key things I think I heard over and over again were about better information, whether it's information communication efficiency or whether it's better data, and partnerships, which is sort of where we thought we'd be, but maybe with a different twist to what we were expecting. So a huge round for the panel. That was a great job. Thank you very much indeed.